right, greetings. I'm Sara Jahnke. I'm the director and principal investigator at the Center for Fire Rescue and EMS Health Research. And welcome to my home office. I will be talking today about a study that we did. It was funded by FEMA through the Assistance to Firefighter Grants. And we did an evaluation of the stress first aid program. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we thought would happen, and then what really did happen, and the outcomes that we did get, and what we saw and what we didn't see. So excited to be a part of this, and I'm bummed that we're not all in person because that would have been a lot of fun. And now I just have to laugh at my own corny jokes, but I considered getting a laugh track for this, but I thought that might be going a little bit too far. But excited to be part of this because this is always a great presentation. So appreciate the invitation from Ed and the crew to present, and I'm excited to get this information out there. My contact information, it should be at the end. If not, I will say it, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. So behavioral health programs, the never ending story, which in my head is like singing that song from the movie, The Never Ending Story. Obviously, I don't think her professionally for a reason, but I think that what we learned from the study is that the process doesn't ever end. Like we had such a vision of what implementing the program would be, and then learned so much about what it is and what it isn't, and how it is so useful in augmenting. But it helps to kind of think about what outcomes you're going to be looking for and what you should expect to see change with the stress first aid intervention. Let's put that in. So I'm going to give a little bit of background in terms of where we were coming from with the study and kind of how we framed it. I mean, we all know, obviously, like you've logged in to learn about behavioral health in the fire service. So we know that fire, EMS, first responders in general are faced with managing everyone's worst day. But I want to take a minute to think about the fact that there are some people who never have an experience so bad in their life that they ever have to call 911. For first responders, for fire, EMS, that this is their everyday. And so what they see, you have to kind of shift, obviously, the way that you think about how you're going to intervene with that. Because for most people, most people, if they went into a therapist and they were talking about some horrific thing they saw, or picking up a dead baby off the ground, or pulling someone out of a pool who was non-responsive, and like that would be the worst thing for a lot of people. So if you look at like the diagnostic and statistical manual, the worst thing, that one event, the qualifying event for PTSD is to be exposed to some sort of trauma or death. And most fire service folks are exposed to that in like their first rotation, right? So like their first 3-4 shifts. So it really is, when we think about these programs and how to evaluate them and how to really build up things for the fire service, we have to keep that in mind, that they are exposed to really awful things on a regular basis. And we know from the literature and from the work that we've done and the work other groups have done, that the mental health and behavioral health fire service is a really complex issue, right? So there's that chronic repeated exposure to trauma. They're showing up to everybody's worst day and being expected to solve whatever problem they're being approached with. There are those acute exposures. So I mentioned like the qualifying diagnosis with PTSD being exposure to some really traumatic experience. We do know that those happen. In the literature, the highest rate of diagnosed PTSD was in, or at least since the last time I reviewed it, was in Oklahoma City bombing first responders in the year following. And so there are some where it's, being present at a line of duty death, being present at some sort of really traumatic event that does cause some people a really acute, kind of, I guess, classic version of post-traumatic stress. There are also the environmental exposures that firefighters are exposed to, and then all these other occupational risks that they face. So one big one is sleep, and these are not sized relative to how important they are, because so many of these I think actually play a really significant role in what we see with behavioral health and the behavioral health outcomes of first responders. Sleep and interrupted circadian rhythm. I mean, that really overlays and underlays all of the other health and behavioral and physical health challenges that firefighters face. There's also injury, disability, both risk of injury and disability, and then the injuries that happen. I mean, we know that there are a lot of chronic injuries that firefighters have to manage kind of across their career. It's a job that's not easy on your body. Home life stressors, and looking at, we've heard, everyone has home and life stressors, but I think one of the things that we see with fire service and with first responders is that it really kind of alters, people are different the day that they come on the job than they are once they've been on the job for a little while, once they've kind of been exposed to all of this. And it kind of changes and shifts your worldview in a lot of ways, is what we heard from a lot of qualitative work we did. And it jives well with what we know from the fire service folks that we work with, is that it really shifts what you see as traumatic, right? So for some people, getting having a tire blowout is really traumatic. But if you are a firefighter and you deal with death every day, or you see, kind of the worst of people and see people at their worst moments, then maybe like a blown out tire isn't that big of a deal. So I think some of the reactions that people have can also create stress at home, is what we were hearing from a lot of the work that we did, and kind of alters, I think I affectionately call it the give a shit meter, but affects, kind of what rises to the level of something that is important. I think it's not a surprise that we see kind of some disturbing rates of things like depression, or people at risk for depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, or injury, or really symptoms. So it's not always like a classic, I have a memory going back to one incident. It's more, 10 worst call type things that come up, but it kind of mimics what you see with other post-traumatic stress responses. Suicidal ideation, substance use and abuse. We've got some stuff in here about alcohol use in particular, which tends to be high with the fire service. I also think that there are some other, at the biologic level, some epigenetic changes. So not that it changes the genes that you come in with, but or that you're born with, but that it can changes what is switched on and off. And then the vicarious trauma. I don't think you can always be exposed to everyone's worst day and not sometimes take some of that stress home with you. And sometimes personally, there's also the stress of like the cancer, cardiovascular disease. I think all the awareness around these issues are important, but there is a certain stress to that. And trying to do the things that you can to mitigate those risk factors can be a lot. And on the other end of the spectrum is really the resilience post-traumatic growth. So we talk about all the negative things a lot, and I don't think it's a bad idea, because I think it's important to be aware and to be to do everything that you can to mitigate those. But I think the other thing we see with fire service is just this amazing resilience and this post-traumatic growth, and all the things that firefighters see and that they're able to respond to and really like value more of their life and their relationships and the family of the fire service. I think is very resilience building, which is why I think the stress first aid model works so well, and it bears out with the data that we have. So another thing that, and I didn't put it on the last slide because I think it, because I couldn't put all these amazing Rambo and superhero pictures on if it was in the last slide. I couldn't figure out how to, this is where I would typically be looking for people to laugh, but I realized it's probably not that funny. But I do think that we need to talk about and this more in the fire service and how it plays in and overlays with behavioral health in general. And that's the whole concept of being a hero or doing something heroic. And I will say that I do believe first responders do daily basis are out doing very heroic things. But I think there's also a challenge within first responder groups in the expectation of self to be a hero, as opposed to seeing the things that are being done as heroic. So an example of this, like with Superman, like he never sits down. You never see the part in the movie where he sits down with Lois Lane and is like, man, this is really stressful. I feel the weight of the world up. It's on my shoulders. I hate flying. I actually really kind of struggle with heights. Like there's never this moment of like vulnerability because he's a hero, right? So he doesn't ever have to be vulnerable because nothing can bother him. Whereas I think the concern sometimes that I've heard with people talking about, being the firefighters are heroes, not that I don't think they do heroic things, but the expectation that you be superhuman, I think, can sometimes be something that is stressful in and of itself. Someone gave me the example of actually one of the union members from FDNY gave me the example. He said he really hated that hero term, especially after 9/11. And I was like, but I really think they are heroes. And he said, the minute he said, if you go out and get a DUI, it's like on the back pages of paper. If one of my firefighters goes out and gets a DUI, it's on the front page of the paper, and it doesn't say there wouldn't be a heading like nerd researcher gets DUI, but they're regularly firefighter gets DUI, fire chief arrested for, and because there is this expectation that they become like superhuman once they're kind of cast in that hero light. So I think that that's another piece of when we talk about behavioral health. It's important, and I think on an individual level, like working with folks and talking to folks, I think there's that certain expectation that we need to pay attention to. So when we talk about what we see in the fire service related to depression and post-traumatic stress, whether you call it, post-traumatic stress disorder, injury, symptoms, we do see rates anywhere. And when you look at population-based, sometimes it's smaller, it's a little bit lower than this, but rates of depression are people in the range of concern around 12 to 27%, depending on the study. Typically, general population, when you're asking last 30 days, you're about less than 10% in the general population. So higher, depending on the group you're asking when you're asking those types of things. Wide range in the literature in terms of people who feel like they're in the range of concern for post-traumatic stress symptoms. General population last 30 days is usually about 3.5%. So obviously a little bit higher. Some of them we do population-based samples, and I'll show you the data from this group. It was actually a little bit lower than that 13%. So it varies pretty significantly, but still I think we see this as an issue in the fire service. And when we talk about how we see this play out, I'm going to talk a little bit alcohol use, which I mentioned earlier. And I always have to give the definition of this because I think sometimes, so just self-disclosure, sometimes I'm not very good at measuring the amount or like my perception of what alcohol is, especially when you're looking like those hard liquors. Like 1.5 ounces is actually not that much. I even think that this glass for wine looks a little bit full for being 5 ounces. But when we talk about what alcohol use and what one drink is, it's these are kind of the standard measures that we use. So 5 ounces of wine, 1.5 ounces of hard liquor, and for the beer that's only like a 5% beer, that would be a 12 ounce beer. So then what is binge drinking? So I'm going to give some information about what we've seen with that in the fire service. And it's based on, now the definition's changed a little bit to where it's now within 2 or more hours. But for men, it's 4 or more drinks. And for women, it's 5 or more drinks in that 2-hour period. Sorry, I'm being interrupted by a small child who was very excited to see his mom. Blood alcohol, so that what it's based on is being intoxicated, like legally intoxicated. So an blood alcohol content of 0.08 or higher. When we ask the fire service, and this data has been amazingly consistent between our literature and other groups that have studied similar things, around half of firefighters report heavy drinking, and about 45 to 56, depending on if it's career or volunteer, report binge drinking in the past 30 days. So heavy drinking would be drinking consistently more than, or on, I can't remember the number of days, but basically consistently drinking 3 or more drinks, I believe what it is what it is on the days off. Now, 10%, interestingly, about 10% reported drinking while intoxicated. This is where, again, you would probably laugh at me for saying something dumb, for driving while intoxicated in the past month, which is interesting because you would expect that people would actually underreport that. So it's likely that it would be more, but the fact that 10% admitted that to us in the study of 700 firefighters is concerning, and probably means that the rate's a little bit higher. When we did, because these rates did seem high, so we've asked this and repeated it in other studies. That last study was the Missouri Valley region, so like the Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, North South Dakota region, Colorado, Wyoming. We repeated it in another national study. So this study was actually Maine to Guam, 20 departments, 10 had implemented wellness fitness initiative, 10 hadn't. And we asked participants about their heavy and binge drinking. When people drank, they drank an average of 3.5 drinks. And again, incredibly consistent given a different sample. Binge drinking was right at 50%. These were all career firefighters. So an interesting thing, when we talk about, I also use this slide when we talk about things like alcohol and cancer, because that average daily intake is exactly where we see that intake for increased risk for cancers. So that's another thing. And I also use it when I talk about obesity, because the average intake of calories on the days that people do drink, which was typically nearly always off-duty days, 551 calories, which is about a Big Mac. So that's a lot of calories to take in on top of the food that you're eating on a day-to-day basis. And when we ask about alcohol use reasons, I bring this up because one of the things that there were some like really like basic, shift schedule, camaraderie, like that's how we get together and how we bond, a lot of traditions around alcohol use. But stress management was often under-recognized as a reason that people drank and the reason people drank heavily. They would talk about like, well, if I've had a rough shift or a rough rotation, I'll meet up and get drinks, or I'll have a beer in the morning or whatever when I get off work. But when I'd say, do you think you use it for stress management? The answer was, no, I don't think so. So just an interesting thing as for the folks who are working with firefighters, the folks who are firefighters, the folks who are engaging with the other firefighters in their department, I think one thing that we all need to kind of be shifting and paying attention to is alcohol use, because I think it can be used quite a bit more than people think. And then there is the issue of suicide in the fire service that's been getting a lot of attention. And I think for important reasons, although people have asked, is there really an epidemic? So there was a couple of surveys done, and they found some consistent things that nearly half of firefighters reported having considered suicide, and 15% had reported attempting suicide. Now, my caution with this data my caution with interpreting this data is that these were all surveys that were sent out where it was like, hey, we want to ask you questions about suicide. So you get a selection bias, right? Where people are like, oh, I'm interested in taking that survey. I'm going to click on the button. I'm going to take the time to take the survey. Now, large sample sizes in both the studies that had this. So I think the fact that you had like where we are relationship to the general population, whatever, I think is less important than the fact that you had enough people. I think one of the surveys was 7,000 people. I mean, the fact that you had enough people who were willing to take the survey, who were even drawn to it, clicked on it and took it, I think is enough reason that we need to at least be discussing this topic. Now, it was a separate study that looked at women in protective services, and they classified all protective services, fire, law enforcement, and EMS together. And then they looked at suicides from occupation, or based on occupation and how their occupation was coded. And women in protective services actually was one of the highest, was the highest rate of suicide compared to the other occupations that were studied in that one. And that was based on death certificates, which is a whole nother, like there's some challenges with death certificate data and how that data is collected and analyzed. So I won't get into that because it would bore both you and me, but I'm going to talk a little bit more later about women in the fire service and what we're seeing with data coming out on that. And so just remember this and be aware of it. About general population, 2 to 9% have attempted suicide. So whether that's where we are exactly point-wise is a little bit up in the air, but still of concern. So when we talked about like how we were going to frame this question and how the SFAI works, and the kind of the model of stress first aid in general and the peer approach. I will completely say that I stole this from Dr. Gist, who I know presented earlier today or yesterday, I think. I totally stole this from him, but I think it was such the perfect example that I couldn't come up with anything better. And that's looking at behavioral health, like where we used to see behavioral health as a heart attack, now we understand behavioral health as hypertension. And so in kind of the heart attack was like, there was this event and it was horrible. And then we would go in and we would fix it, and we, had this process in place. And even that model has shifted, no matter what model you're using, a lot of, really all of them are kind of shifting to more understanding this as hypertension. And I think it's a better way to look at it, because we learn from the data from kind of that approach was that different incidents affect different people at different times, right? So, and the intervention is not necessarily the same for all. It was interesting the number of times I've talked to someone like after giving a presentation like this, or I've had a couple of times where I've written things. And I've had people contact me and say, it's so funny, you should say that. Not funny, ha ha, but like, I appreciated, I think is probably a better word. I appreciated that you wrote that, because there was a call that I was on. Everyone on my crew was bothered by it except for me. But like, if you're an 18-year-old and you don't have kids, and you run a, pediatric death call, and everyone else comes back and they all have, a 2-year-old, just like the 2-year-old that just died, like that's going to hit them differently than it hits the 18-year-old. And people have said that. They said, I came back, everyone else was torn apart. And I was thinking, like, what is wrong with me that I am not upset by this? Like, am I so calloused? Am I so emotionally blunted, whatever, that it doesn't bother me? And so the intervention is not going to be the same for all people. And that's the beauty of kind of the new model. But we also know now that the impact's not always immediate. Sometimes you just put blinders on and go in and do the thing that you need to do. And it's not till later that something comes back to you that you're like, whoa, okay. Like you thought you locked it away, and maybe didn't necessarily, maybe it's not, it's all there, right? So you've experienced it all. It's all in those synapses are fired. And so you have it in your brain. And then we found that sometimes, like, forcing people to face things and to intervene and to think about and talk about things in a way when they're not ready, and it's for some people it can be more harmful than helpful. So like generally you think like, oh, doing something is better than doing nothing, which isn't true if doing something is more harmful than doing nothing. So there's been like a lot of thought around that, which is kind of what kicked this whole thing off way back when it started, and really like looking at this behavioral health in the fire service from a new approach. And that's how we had to look at this, doing these assessments. So in some ways, if behavioral health was like a heart attack, it'd be way easier to study, right? But it's not, which is why we had some of the challenges we had. But basically, we now understand that behavioral health is a long-term problem, and the solutions have to be long-term too. So it's not going to be like a one and done, like X thing happened, we're going to do Y, Z, you're going to be fine. It's also a shift in the lifestyle and culture of the department. And that's really where we focus the assessment outcome, is that like it's not, did X event happen and then you guys did this, and then Y guys and gals did this, and then Y, Y was the outcome. It's more, did we change the way the department and the crews and the individuals think and talk and express things about behavioral health? It's also just awareness and helping people to know, like, this is something that we should be talking about. This is something we can talk about, and really monitoring symptoms along the way and treating as appropriate. Treating as appropriate is not always like, hey, you're struggling, you have to run right to a therapist. Big fan of therapy myself. Highly recommend it if people are at the point that they think that will be helpful, but that's not what everybody needs. Sometimes what you need is to sit down with a cup of coffee and someone who understands where you're coming from. And so what is the appropriate level of intervention? And really, Stress First Aid is designed all around that. And I'm not going to like do the entire thing again, but like you can see that in the beauty of the approach, right? That it's not just a stressor. It's really understanding that these stressors can come at any time. The process is continuous. It's circular and you can jump around. And it's really understanding, like, when someone's struggling, how do you recognize that they're struggling? How do you respond to it, right? And then looking at, and I'm sure that you've seen this one before, but really looking at kind of what is the process? What are the areas of intervention that we have, and what trainings do we have? And so when we designed the study, we looked at the program components and we looked at the different training scenarios. And I tell you what, we had what we thought was going to be like a beautiful study, and it seemed so straightforward when we wrote it, and we were so excited to get it rolling. We had specific aim 1, conduct a process evaluation of the implementation. Specific aim 2, find out how acceptable it is. Do people like it? Do they feel like it resonates? Specific aim 3, beautiful, two-arm cluster randomized trial of stress first aid, crossover control, and we're going to look at these interventions, and we've got all the trainings in place, and it's going to be so easy. So did not happen. We even had like this diagram, took a long time to create, but I thought it was beautiful. And we had like, here's all the pieces we're going to do, and we're going to be here. B, we're going to come in and say these things. C, we're going to come in and say these things. And like best laid plans, right? Had our initial stakeholder advisory meeting. Dr. Gist was there, Dr. Golver, Dr. Watson, who came up with it, like great crew who helped us devise it, helped us select departments. What we wanted were 8 departments that had not implemented a program, but that had the capacity to do so. So we ended up finding 8 departments all over the country, different sizes. We had 2 that were combinations, so we were trying to implement it also with their volunteer firefighters, and asked and basically went in and did what we thought, we were going to do, which was do that sit down with the department leadership. And when we initially started it was just to brief them. So giving them some information about what the training was going to be. We wanted everyone in the department to do the stress first aid, the curbside manner, and the after action review. And then we gave it, each one had some funds to do, and we recommended that they do the IAFF awareness. And then they were also allowed to do, or with the funds, a lot of them did other types of peer approaches, brought in other trainings, those types of things. We also had our gold standard for the training, right? So Frank Lido, Patricia Watson went into each of those departments and did the trainings with the personnel that were selected to kind of be the key folks. So those kind of key peer team members. We also, and ahead of time, said, hey, we want all the providers that you work with in your EAPs to get the Helping Heroes program, right? So it's out of USC, great clinician training. And ahead of time, all the EAPs had provisionally said, yeah, sure. And then we had a couple other sections that were like, we're also going to offer this department to department coaching, which kind of came up later. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But then also recommended and gave funds that they could do that, send folks to either the peer behavioral health from IFF or one of the other trainings, depending on the area they were in. And so basically said, like, here's all the pieces. I've got a list. We had so many lists, and everything was color coded, and it was gorgeous. And we really thought we knew how this was going to go. And so 2 months before, we would do the organizational conference call. 1 month before, we would set them up with, we ended up adding this in, and I'll talk about that again, like I said, in a second. But we, had it all set up. We would do the baseline data collection. The trainings would come in. For the stress first aid, we would bring Frank and Patricia in. We'd have a great time with them, get them trained up, and then the departments would implement and have everyone do the online trainings. And then we come back and do data collection. Like, beautiful, right? Everyone is, I'm sure, sitting there going like, God, this is a beautiful workflow plan for a study. And so our first thing that we learned was that as we gave the departments the paper, and loved all of the departments we worked with, fantastic departments, is we would give them the stuff and they would go, okay, but what do we need to do? And I'm like, well, we just gave you this packet. Like, you have all of our, it's color coded even, and you have links, and we ended up adding in this department to department consultation with Chief Oates, because they would go, okay, but what do we do? Like, operationally, how do we operationalize this? And so we realized that there was really a need for more like laying out the groundwork, and that it is not just you're going to take a manual and send everyone this link, then this link, then this link, but it really takes more of getting some folks on board. We work with Chief Oates because he's done such a great job really with his department, and he did a great job getting buy-in from both the union and the management. They had a lot of great conversations. He had some great perspectives on what you do and don't do, like how kind of you create the autonomy among the group for them to be able to work, and how you help select people. So, and I love this. His team started, and most of the departments use this, larger departments had to get a little bit more creative with it. One of the things that we heard consistently was the people on your peer team is not always who you're going to expect. And the people, so he asked the question, select the names of the members you feel comfortable talking to about a work-related or non-work-related problem. And we consistently heard this back from our departments, but about half the people on the list were exactly who you would think. So it's, the chaplain or the, some folks in the department that are just like key opinion thought leaders who are really highly respected. But consistently about half the departments, half the people on the list that the departments that did this were people that they were like, man, I never would have guessed that person. In fact, we consistently heard people tell the story that they would go to these people and say, hey, we sent that survey out. Remember, we're looking for people for our peer team. Your name was picked. And people, like, half the people on the list were like, are you kidding? What? So I think even that in and out of itself is like an interesting lesson learned about how do you find those folks. Sometimes you want people who are enthusiastic about it, but sometimes you have to be careful about who those folks are so you can make sure that you build like the trust for that team, that those are going to be the people that, when people are really kind of struggling, that's going to be their first phone call. So it was an interesting approach, and it was interesting to hear that was pretty consistent across departments too. But John did a great job, went in, talked to the folks, and kind of laid out their steps and processes, and did a lot of question answering early on. And then as we designed the evaluation component for this, it's a challenge because, like I said, if it were a heart attack, it's really easy to tell if you did or did not take care of a heart attack, right? If we knew that, going to this type of call caused this type of response, and if you did this intervention, then everyone would be fine. It'd be so easy. You would wait for that. You'd go in and measure, you'd wait for that event to happen, and then you'd go back right after and go like, how's everyone feeling? But that's not, that's just not the case. And so with these types of prevention programs and looking at really like a cultural shift, it's not as focused on specific to one outcome, right? It's really more looking at and asking questions around, are we able to change the environment in the department? Can we change perceptions about how ready the department is to respond, about how prepared people are to respond? Can we change some perceptions around things like stigma, and get people to feel more comfortable, more heard? I mean, some of it feels a little bit mushy as I'm saying it, but it is kind of a different focus than just looking specifically. It'd be so much easier if we were just measuring symptoms of post-traumatic stress, which we measured, but it was a little bit different than that. So we asked questions around just the evaluation. So what did you think for the folks who went in? And honestly, across the board, people were quite impressed with it, and they felt very satisfied. Like they felt across the board like the trainings were useful, that they were things that they, for the most part, would use or they could see themselves using. Obviously you would always want it to be 100%, but it's never going to be 100%. But to see that, like, especially that peer team training, that almost between 80 and 90% of people were like, yes, I'm likely or very likely that I will use this with my colleagues. Like that's a great number for something like that. And our numbers for the online pieces, great numbers for an online training. We asked questions around knowledge before and after, so pre-post, and those p-values could not be more beautiful. Basically, yes, we did see changes and improvements in knowledge across the board on the question on the domains that were assessed. Now, I said we did collect that. We didn't do this with the idea that we would see specific changes in post-traumatic stress or depression or anxiety. And part of that, I think in the long term, I think if it had been a longer study, and I think that's one of the things that we need to look at. I think in the future, we will see a longer term on those types of things. But we did ask some like basic baseline questions, and we found that 40% of our participants screened positive for at least one of the behavioral health domains. So it wasn't necessarily, you could screen positive in more than one, but about 40%. And this isn't diagnosed depression. It's just in the range of concern for these things. We've got about 40% were struggling with some sort of behavioral health thing, and nearly a quarter of our respondents screened positive for alcohol problems, so that they were really and this was, obviously related to behavioral health when we looked at that relationship. And then more than half of firefighters at baseline reported lower than normal levels. So normal levels being it was a validated measure of the general population. But 54.9% felt that they did not feel that they had emotional support. So the questions that we decided to that really are the main outcomes of this type of intervention was asking questions around department environment. And it was, I mean, again, beautiful data here, but how prepared the department was. So the question was, how prepared do you believe your department is to respond to behavioral health issues? And we saw a significant improvement before and after the training, and it was a year apart. Like, that's the other nice thing about being able to look at this across time is it's not the type of question that someone goes, I remember what I said last year and I'm going to say a little bit better this year. So when we looked across, I think we had about almost 800 firefighters, maybe between 700 and 800. We did see significant improvement with the training. In terms of how well trained the personnel were with the department, again, saw significant improvement. So even though the trainings are relatively short and enjoyable, if you ask me, because I've seen them, it really did have an impact, and people felt like they were better trained by having this type of thing implemented. And then we talked specifically about how confident the firefighters were in the skills and knowledge of their company officers to handle behavioral health issues. That's another area where we saw statistically significant improvement. So overall, really positive results from implementing the stress first aid. Some other questions we asked were around like the negative reactions to behavioral health issues, and looking at we had that control group, and then we had the treatment group. So the delay, well, I say control group, it was delayed treatment group. So it was across the group line. And we found that the folks in the stress first aid group really were more positive. Well, it wasn't statistically significant because we didn't have, it wasn't awful to start out with. We did see that there were improvements in that. So it does look like we were headed in the right direction with improvements, or with having less negative reactions about behavioral health interventions. And then we also found that there was a shift in people saying that they felt in the stress first aid condition compared to control, that they did feel like that there was more social support from their department. So specific questions, I have someone who will listen to me when I need to talk. I have someone I trust to talk about my feelings. Like, we saw bigger gains with that and differences post-intervention in the departments that had the stress first aid. I have someone to talk to when I have a bad day, and I have someone with whom to share my most private worries and fears. So, which sounds really hokey, but they answered the question, so I appreciate that. And it wasn't, so another interesting thing about interventions like this is we want people to be more aware. We assume that a lot of the social support they're going to get, and we did find, in fact, that a lot of social support that they got was from within their department. But then you'll notice the questions aren't necessarily, it doesn't have to be in your department. Is it your company officer? Is it your? And so I think that what we see with this data also is that people, like, as you sensitize them to their issue, to the issues around behavioral health and start that conversation, that it really does generalize. It's not just, it's not just that I can talk to my company officer. It's really that there's, that we're shifting the culture, we're shifting the conversation about behavioral health and how to think about it. Some other findings from the study that were not measured, but part of that kind of that process evaluation that I thought were really interesting. One of the big ones was warm handoffs. So this was a challenge in that we really thought, because we had talked to the EAPs and they, we had calls with every EAP, that we wanted to make sure that with an intervention like this, when you start shifting that conversation at the department level and you start saying, hey, let's talk about what we can do to improve, reduce stigma around getting help and those types of things. We also have to make sure that once you've asked that question, you have the resources, because like I said, not everyone needs therapy, but sometimes people do need therapy. And sometimes they are at the point where, like, it's bigger than something that can have to, take place, or a conversation that needs to be had on the tailboard of the fire truck or around the kitchen table. Sometimes they do need some more help. So we worked with all the EAPs, and of the total 8 departments, we had 2 providers that went back and took it. And so I think what it really spoke to, and I don't think it's an issue with the training. I think it's an issue with, you really have to think through who you're going to have as providers in your department. You want people who are familiar with the fire service, who are familiar with the task, the job, and the humor. Because I often say, like, that dark humor, if you told some of those jokes that you tell around the kitchen table when you come back from a call at Thanksgiving dinner, grandma would have you committed. Like, she would not think that that was appropriate. But it is the way the fire service deals with it. And you need to have people, I've heard horror stories about people that have gone to a therapist who, the therapist just couldn't handle it. Someone told me a story about a therapist who just started bawling, or times that someone's been, they found a therapist who was just like overly interested in the day-to-day of the job and not really caring about what the person was presenting with. So I think the only thing worse than not sending someone to get help is sending them to someone who isn't going to be helpful. Because I think once you finally get to the point where you're like, okay, I'm going to make that phone call, like, that's a hard phone call to make. So I think once you do make that phone call, you want to make sure as a department that you have created or identified and provided the resources for someone who's a good match for the folks. So I think that's, and if there's a bad provider out there, everyone will hear about it. If there's a good provider, people don't want to talk about the fact that they went to a therapist, but making sure that those resources are set up, I think, is also kind of a key piece and lesson learned from this. So I think kind of the take home message is, even like I was bragging about our P values earlier, and I don't apologize for that, but I think we also need to look at some of the kind of lessons learned from this in more of a qualitative approach. I think some of the opportunities and some of the areas that were interesting to us, the peer team is not always who you expect. And I think one of the key takeaways is we need to be open to that there are going to be people that you don't recognize as being strong peers, and that you need to be open to kind of finding those folks, because other people are going to find them, whether they're trained or not. We did find that it was important to have this increased awareness of how complex the relationship is, and really focusing on department level awareness and support. So even if not everyone is, doing an in-depth training with Frank Lito and Patricia Watson and hearing like their brilliance, like the conversation needs to be happening department wide. And the peer support, really using the peer support program as a resource, and then also continual training. So we had, I told you we had, you saw my beautifully color-coded chart. We had all those trainings, but one of the things that we quickly learned is that once people read through the trainings, they're like, okay, now what? What else should we be learning? And I think we learned that those teams need to be empowered to, train each other, train themselves, find things in the community, and really like continue that. But it's not a one and done. Some other things that we learned around just allowing that creativity with the peer team. We had so many creative ideas, everything from like departments that created a logo, mugs. I loved this. One of the departments had coffee mugs made. So they put a couple of coffee mugs in each station, and it had the information about how to contact the peer team, because like it's sitting around all the time, right? One department ended up making shirts because they said, and they had their folks go out and they like divided up the territory where they would go in and kind of give the message about some of the, like whatever the message of the month was. And but then there was like also this beautiful camaraderie of being part of the peer team, which I think is also important. They were all trained in how to do the warm handoffs when necessary. And they had kind of a process of how people got referred if they didn't have someone that they reached out to directly. I think that another big lesson learned was just this ongoing communication and collaboration between the peer members, and having the leadership know enough that things are going on, that they continue to support it, but not feeling like they have to be down in the weeds of it, because that could have been a struggle. We didn't have that with any of our problems, but we didn't have that issue with any of our departments, but also continuity is a struggle, and it was a struggle for several of our departments. We had a couple departments that basically had to pick up and restart the program a couple times in the 1 year that we were there. And so really, like we had some that did a great job of like having a succession plan and kind of like here's the binder of what we've done, here's what next steps, and really thinking that through from the start you need to have more than one champion. If you have one enthusiastic person, that is awesome until that person gets transferred out to another position, and then you're screwed because then you have to start over from scratch. And so really, like, how can you continue it? And then how can you have kind of that ongoing collaboration between the team? And another really important piece, I think, is understanding that those peer team members put a lot into this. And we need to be making sure that the peer team members are taking care of each other and taking care of themselves. Like, it's a lot to ask someone to take on, check in, make sure people are okay, and you're going to be the person that people lean on. That's a lot for people to take on, especially, I mean, these are people typically picked because they will do anything for anyone. And so making sure those people are taken care of also is important, and giving them the peer support of the peer supporters. So we know, like, overall, I think we learned and had affirmed that there is a lot that's working really well in the fire service. The camaraderie, the dark humor, the social support, the debriefing in terms of like sitting down around the kitchen table, the conversations that happen around dinner, like those are so resilience building. The family support and shared experiences and fire service identity, like being part of something bigger, is so beneficial. I often give the example of tattoos. Like, I love my job. I don't have one. I am a scientist tattooed on my body. There's no p-values. There's no nothing. If you look at the fire service, how many people do you know that have like flames and the crust and the, a Dalmatian or whatever? It's very common, right? Because that's so much a part of the identity of who they are. And that is awesome. And that's so resilience building. And it's so much a part of why I think we don't see worse behavioral health outcomes than we do. You can go to any conference and see, like, even for the family, like my dad is a firefighter, my husband, firefighter's wife. I still have not found a fire or a scientist husband pair of pants with that written across the butt of the pants for my husband. I don't think it's made. I'm going to probably have to make it myself, but like, it's just not that same, you don't have that same camaraderie with other occupations. And I think also one of the things that we did here, and I didn't make a slide on this, but I should mention it, things like retirement, it's a time that a lot of people struggle with because of that fire service identity, because of being so much a part of the family of fire service. And then what about when you're not? Especially people that are separated from service early because of some sort of disability. Like, you lose that. And so that can be definitely a challenge, and something that, as I think the peer teams are being formed, something to pay attention to. And using those people, like, once they're out of the fire service or out of the department, still have like amazing resources to share and skills. So those things all work really well, but then what if it doesn't? And I mentioned earlier, I added this in here because I think it is the thing that we need to be focusing on as part of this big picture. This is data from a study we did on women in the fire service. Now we have another set of data that we're working on that I had a meeting actually fortuitously just today on. So hopefully the data will be out on that soon. We'll look, and that one was specific to more the concept of bullying in the fire service. We asked women about their experiences of discrimination and harassment. And we looked and we compared, these questions were specific, we mirrored off of a report card that was done by the Women in Fire group. And we actually did see some, rates lowering from what they saw about a decade ago. And at first I was like, oh my God, that's fantastic. Rates are lower than they were. Different sampling techniques, so it's not like directly comparable. But I got really excited about it until I started looking at some of these numbers. And like 40% of women in a survey we did just a couple, well, by now it's been maybe 2 years ago, 40% of those women reported shunning and isolation. 5% reported being assaulted on the job. Now, I'm like, oh my God, that's fantastic. Only 5% instead of 6.3%. We had survey responses from a couple thousand women. So 5% of a couple thousand are being assaulted at work. And I think, I think that number, like, I think we can all very much agree that number should be 0. No assaults at work, I think, is a perfect goal for the fire service and every other workplace that's ever been invented. But we wanted to look at this and see what is going on, because we saw that rate of of suicide among women in protective services was so high compared to other occupation groups. So like wanted to dig into like, what is that? Because you have to ask like, oh, maybe they're just not made to do the job, right? Like maybe women are just too like genteel and soft and can't handle the stress of it. So we started digging into it. Like, that is an empirical question if I have ever heard one. Although we didn't, you actually use the term genteel, but you know what I mean. So we looked at the data, and again, it asked about people's experiences, and some high numbers here about things that are going on in the fire service. We wanted to know, are these outcomes because they're women, or is it something else? So we looked low, medium, and high people, and we divided it levels of discrimination. So low levels of discrimination, high levels, and then that in between. So divided it in thirds. We looked at demographics to see is there like one group that's being discriminated against and harassed? And there was no statistically significant differences between groups. So it's not like a thing. It's not just the new people. It's not just the old people. It's not just the firefighters. It's not just the white people. It's not just the not white people. It's no statistically, you get the idea, no statistically significant differences by demographics. But when we looked at the impact of it, check this out. Again, love this data because it's so pretty. Low range, people in the range of concern for depression, these women, 15%. High range, about 3 times that. Obviously, I don't need a statistician to tell me that was significant. But when we looked at current anxiety symptoms, also a significant trend and beautifully linear trend, where people that were experiencing higher rates of discrimination harassment also were more likely to experience anxiety and symptoms of post-traumatic stress. When we looked at physical health, so like that's the answer, right? So my very educated, based on the data, guess would be that the women that we saw that were those ones that were committing suicide were likely those women in the very high range of discrimination and harassment. And again, I think we'll see the data and time and data analysis will tell. Correct myself up. But I think we'll see the same thing with the data that we have on men. Now, in terms of physical health impacts, poor physical health days, we actually saw more. So on average, 4 for women who are in that high range of discrimination harassment against, I think my colors are awful on this, but I think it's 2.8 in the low range. So we saw more poor physical health days, and we're more likely to be injured. So discrimination and harassment and ostracizing someone, again, I'm going to just leap based on the data I've seen so far, that's similar for male and female, that like if you rob people of that camaraderie and that family of the fire service, there are very real and measurable mental and physical health impacts of that. Now, interestingly, because another question that came to my mind, and we had the data to answer it, was, they just don't love the job? They don't like being firefighters, and so they're just, stressed out. No, for the most part, even those in the very high range of discrimination and harassment still love the job. And I'd ask them the qualitative part, I'd hear these horrific stories, and I would say, man, woman, I bet you regret doing this. And they go, oh no, I hate being treated like shit, but I love the job. There's nothing better than the job. Now, when you get to the high range of discrimination and harassment, I'm way less likely to recommend it to a daughter or friend or sister. So that's just, I add that caveat because I think that it's important to pay attention to that. I think that the trainings need to make sure, as people are selecting peer teams, I think it's important to remember you've got to provide someone to the entire department. And sometimes those women are really struggling in a way that, or the people that are being ostracized are really struggling and are really going to have a really negative impact. So creating a behavioral health program, I know there's a whole other presentation on the what else section of it that Brittany's going to do, and it's going to be fantastic. But I think the take-home message in terms of what we saw from the data was that you have to have that buy-in from all directions. You have to build that team, identify resources, resource them so they feel like they have the support. I think the regular interactions with the team are important, that team self-care and understanding that there is a weight of the taking care of everyone who takes care of everyone. I think the idea of prospective hindsight. So looking and thinking, okay, in the future, if something happens, what are we going to wish we had in place? If we have a line of duty death in this department, it's going to hit everyone hard. What are we going to hope we had in place? And then let's create that and put it in place now. Let's make sure that we have these resources set up. Let's make sure that if we have a, you know, school shooting here, we've got the people that we can pull in to do what needs to be done to help our folks, right? Ongoing evaluation, both like written evaluation and just both qualitative and quantitative. How are we doing with stuff? And then training. So both the training for the folks that are going to be the boots on the ground doing the work with others, and just general training for the department. And I use this picture. Actually, there was a better picture their graphic designer put in for this slide. Like, it was a better picture of the stairs, but I said, you got to trade it back out for this in particular, because this is the Manitou Springs incline. If you've ever been there, it's a mile straight up towards Pikes Peak of these like old railroad ties, and you just have to, like, it just doesn't stop. You just have to keep going until you get to the top. So you look at this and you're like, that looks overwhelming to get there. This is the bottom of the incline. When you look up at the top, for those of you who've done it, you can attest to that being Sob Hill. Sob Hill is halfway. You just can't see the other half of it. And it's called Sob Hill because when you get there, you feel like crying when you realize that you're only halfway. But then the other reason it's called Sob Hill is because you get there, and I've heard so many people actually on the incline say this, where you look up and you're like, son of a bitch, we're only halfway. And I use this as the example because that's so the way creating a behavioral health program is. Like, you could create all these pieces, and that's what we learned, I think, more than anything else from this, from what we did, is that you create all this and you think you have everything in order and in line, and that's great. And that is a fantastic start. But no matter how color-coded and beautiful and laid out and whatever it is, you just have to keep going. You just have to keep going, because you're not ever finished with this. So I promised my contact information. I fortunately am not a liar. Here's my email, my phone number. Feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions. And I hope everyone has a great day and enjoys all the rest of the presentation.